Good morning. My name is Matt, and I'm one of the pastors here at Watershed. This past, February or March, somewhere around in those months of this year, I started noticing that anytime I would access the Maps app portion of my phone to try to get from one place to the next, I would punch in my destination of choice, but then the starting point would not be a reflection of where I was physically punching my destination in from. It would always end up starting me at one of two places, either the parking lot at my kids' high school, South Meck High School, or the home that we just recently moved from about 3 months ago in Huntingtown Farms. I noticed that this would happen almost always when I was late. And so I was trying to get from point A to point B, but I would, punch the destination in, and Siri, who usually verbally directs me and tells me where I'm supposed to go, would just be silent. She would just completely shut down, and I would see this blue line from South Meck to wherever I was supposed to go, but I was in nowhere even close to that path, and I would have to then resort to, as I was driving, spreading the maps portion open. You know what I'm talking about? To see the individual streets, and okay, this is where I am, and I think if I go up here and take a left, and by that point, I might as well have been charting a course looking at the stars. It seemed so backwards compared to where we are in our technology today. And then finally, after a few weeks of torturing myself this way, I decided I was going to wipe my phone clean, restart it to reset it to its original settings. And wouldn't you know, once I did all of that, it worked. Everything worked the way it's supposed to. It's a little slower because it's an iPhone 6. Don't judge me. But it was really good news. It was really good news because it was really difficult trying to figure out how to get where I wanted to go when there wasn't an accurate starting point. We're in the sixth weekend of a series of conversations that we've been calling Disorganized Religion, where we've been paying attention to some of the shifts that we notice taking place when somebody starts to migrate from an organized religious experience or background towards something more open, more progressive. And in fact, last weekend we spent some time talking about some of the shifts as it relates to the scriptures, the way that we look at the Bible. And I want to return to the passage that we spent time with last weekend, at least for just a moment, and not even the whole passage, but the first verse of the passage that we observed last week. It's Romans chapter 5, where Paul writes to a group of Christians in Rome, this sort of collision of Jewish Christians and Roman Greco-Christians that were trying to figure out how to be a community. He says, "But God shows his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." I don't know what your experience was growing up, but in the organized religion of my past, sin was like this incredibly strong focal point. In fact, it was, I would argue, sort of like the center of gravity, fueling so much of what I understood to be true about God or myself, to the extent that there were like these particular verses, I think I call them sort of clobber verses, that created a progression and an explanation forward for why Jesus died and why I had a spot reserved in heaven for me. And so the first clobber verse is actually, most of them are actually in this letter that Paul writes, but it's a verse in Romans chapter 3 where Paul writes, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." And in the expression of my past, this was an explanation. There's an explanation behind this verse that suggested that in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve sinned, at that point humanity became separated from God. Individually, this was true, and from a large scale, this is true. And from that point moving forward, almost like a computer virus, that's corrupting the software of a computer. This sort of a modern day analogy. Every single person moving forward is born from the moment that they breathe their first breath with this built-in sin nature. And so that's like clobber verse 1. And then clobber verse 2 is this, where Paul writes, "For the wages of sin is death." This verse was used to support the belief that sin or sinners had to be punished. That's just the economy that God created, that God found us, that God created this economy, and he finds us in this economy so repulsive that he has to solve a way, he has to figure out a way to no longer find us repulsive, so that we can have a relationship at some level with him now, and then also we can escape hell in the future. And so that verse sort of puts that out in front of us, but then also that verse says, listen, there's actually a gift, there's actually good news in this as well, that in spite of our condition, God actually does love us. He's created a way for this to happen, and he demonstrates his love through that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. And this verse was used to support the belief that all of our sin, our nature, the things that we've done wrong with our life, anytime we've skated outside the boundaries of the moral boundaries that our Christian culture or our way of understanding absolute truth functions, anytime we skate outside those boundaries, that sin was actually transferred onto Jesus, and through this really violent, punitive act of crucifixion, our sins are washed clean, they're forgiven, thereby freeing up God to love us and to accept us fully, both today and into eternity. And so that's like the first three clobber verses. And then the last one, there's actually some clobber verses that we could pull out of Romans, but one of the more popular is actually John 3:16, that says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." And so that's like the last clobber verse in the Bible, or you can just watch a football game on Sunday and see that for yourselves on the screen. And then once you move through those, there was often this sort of process of helping people grab hold of this. If you would admit that you were a sinner and turn from your sin, as long as you were willing to believe that Jesus' sacrifice was enough for God to love you, and as long as you were willing to have some sort of public confession with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, then you would be saved from sin and gain entrance to heaven. And it sort of gave you a nice acronym, admit, believe, and confess. It was the ABCs of Christianity. I actually was told this growing up. And so in the organized religion of my past, this was called good news. This is called the gospel. And actually, it's one of several ways or theories over the last 2,000 years that people have tried to make sense of why Jesus died and what we're supposed to do with the resurrection. And I don't so much want to dive into the different theories behind that event as much as I want to dive into or put some energy towards the particular way of understanding who we are at the core of ourselves. When I was growing up in church, there were things that I was told were absolutely true. I mentioned this last weekend, that it was absolutely true that the Bible was the inspired, infallible Word of God. Like every word, every phrase was an exact representation of God's voice being translated into through humans into reality. I was told, therefore, that creation, a literal 7-day creation story, was absolutely true. That the flood, absolutely true. Jonah swallowed by a fish for 3 days, absolutely true. Burning bushes, water coming from rocks, people walking on water, all of these things are absolutely true. But there was also something about myself that I was told was absolutely true as well, and that I was a sinner. That at the core of who I was, from the moment I was conceived, the moment my heart beat for the first time, from God's perspective, I was damaged goods. I was unworthy. This is the message that I heard at 6, which does certain things to you at 6. You know, like at 6, I still believed that Santa was real. right? That the North Pole was an actual place. Actually, the North Pole is an actual place, but like Santa's workshop actually was there, all right? Just making sure that you know I do know basic geography. And if Santa is real in a 6-year-old's mind, then so is an angry God, so is hell as punishment. These are real as well. I can remember having like these waves of anxiety that I would have to deal with because, again, so much emphasis was placed on accepting this belief, giving Jesus all of my heart. And so I literally remember I would clench my fist sometimes and go, like from the visceral gut part of myself going, am I believing enough? And then also really feeling almost terrified because clearly I'm not believing enough. I'm still cussing and telling dirty jokes and lying to my parents and cheating on tests like all of my other 5th grade friends at the time. I have a friend who was telling me recently about her childhood and her early adult way of understanding herself in this capacity, being trapped in cycles of guilt and fear, or guilt, shame, and fear actually, like feeling guilty for ways that she behaved. This is in her adulthood even. Ways that she behaved or ways that she thought that she viewed as out of bounds based on her experience and her culture. Being trapped in a certain degree of shame because there were times where she just didn't have the courage to talk about this with others, and so she carried around this private guilt, and then couldn't sometimes turn the corner on some of the ways that she behaved and thought, and then being terrified because, gosh, like am I really, have I set myself up for expulsion after this lifetime because I can't seem to be who I'm supposed to be or even believe hard enough for the ways that I'm supposed to believe. And then she said something interesting. She said, I also found that during that time of life, I was really good at judging people. Like I knew the boundaries, and so anytime a person or a group of people stepped out of bounds, like it was really easy for me to, in a quick fashion point and go, oh look, see, they're clearly a sinner, or they're clearly away from God, which sounds more like projection to me, like taking all the ways that you're experiencing shame and guilt and fear, and you're projecting those onto other people just to relieve your fear. And then I have this other friend that recently was telling me that at 10, she would lay awake at night and she would inventory her day and almost create a checklist for things that she could ask God to forgive her for, but then struggle to go to sleep because what if she forgot something? And what if she woke up in the morning and God hadn't forgiven her, or he's holding her accountable for the thing that she forgot to mention? I don't know how much of your religious experience, your past, includes this way of thinking, but what I've learned being the pastor here for 13 years with a lot of folks who come from all different walks of life, Catholic, Protestant, and beyond, it's possible that these are the things that you were forced to contend with growing up and maybe even into adulthood. And no different than a faulty GPS system. If you get started off from the wrong place, it can be really hard to find your way where you ultimately want to go in life, or even more so, where you want to go with God. And so I want to draw a few observations about sin as a starting point. And some of these might sound a little harsh if you're just exiting some of these organized religious past, or maybe you're still a part of some of those. If this is your first Sunday, welcome. Hopefully it's not your last. But here's, if I could just get an umbrella of grace this morning as I kind of talk through these, because I think the ending could be quite redemptive. Here's the first thing I would say. In organized religion, my observation is that sin serves as a hook to create a culture of codependency between the church and its constituents. And here's what I mean by this. In my past experience, the meta-narrative was this. And when I say past experience, I mean like as early as like 7 or 8 years ago. Watershed started, with this type of disposition. The meta-narrative was this: you, Matt O'Neill, have an unsolvable problem. You are a sinner. You didn't sign up for that, but that's what was handed to you. And because of this, you're unworthy before God. But take rest. We as the church have the solution to your problem. We know what to tell you to think, what to tell you to believe, and we know what to tell you, or know how to tell you to behave. And if you can continue to return here and hear those things, then you're going to be fine. And so what happens in that economy with sin as the sort of hook in all of it is this back and forth motion. The church needs people to continue to propagate that narrative. It needs people to function and exist, but then people need the narrative so that they can feel safe. And so back and forth it goes. In disorganized religion, though, it's a different conversation. Sin isn't a hook, but sin instead is a symptom of a problem. It's a wound or a sickness yet to be discovered. And so let me try to bumble my way through an example on this regard. In organized religion, often the conversation about sin gets trapped in behavior modification. If somebody can just turn away from their nature or turn away from their sin, turn away from sinful behaviors or feelings, then the assumption is transformation. That somehow I'm completely fixed. And so, for instance, let's use the example of sex outside of marriage, which is often a cardinal sin in organized religion. Let's say a person has lived promiscuously throughout their life. They've gone from one sexual relationship, one sexual partner to another. And at first, this really isn't a big deal. It's rather exciting. It's enjoyable. But then for a host of possible reasons, let's say these experiences become painful or unfulfilling. And so then at some point this person decides I have to exit this and I'm going to go back to God. I'm going to return to God, which at one level means I'm going to go back to the religion of my past. And when that person shows up, usually the arms are wide open. Come on in, let us help you. But then also align with us in the way that we view sexuality and promiscuity. And they often do. They turn to, quote, turn from their sin and begin practicing abstinence. And this progression, this change will actually change their life. Like that, and I know this personally. That's my story. I've mentioned that here before. You begin to experience validation from that spiritual community. That's changing in and of itself. You begin to be free of the guilt and shame of doing something that you categorically defined as wrong to begin with, and that community defines it as wrong. Because you have now defected from relationships that tend to be superficial and codependent, that tend to be marked by objectification, there's a sense that peace and healing begin to take place. Your life literally changes, and that is a very good thing, and I am not trying to undermine that at any level. But the narrative is often, I turned from my sin and God changed my life. But often, that's as far as the story gets. That's as far as the explanation travels. And when it gets trapped in obedience and prohibition, it's like it loses the capacity to engage this whole other reality in our humanity. So for instance, it fails to acknowledge the way our past has created emotional and spiritual mappings of ourself, our inner space. Mappings that shape our drives and our desires. Mappings that are more often than not, we're asleep to them. It fails to both ask and answer the question, why was I driven to make decisions throughout my lifetime that continue to create pain for myself and pain for others, beyond an explanation of, well, you're just a sinner. That's usually the response. Why do I do the things I do? Well, because it's your sin nature. You're a sinner. In some ways, it's the difference between, it's a difference in a conversation between an external locus of control and an internal locus of control. Maybe you're familiar with this, maybe you're not, but a locus of control is the degree to which someone believes they have control over the outcome or the events in their life. Someone who has a strong external locus of control relies on outside factors to create or make sense of the outcomes of their life. For someone with a strong external locus of control that's involved in a organized religious community, and even beyond an organized religious community. The authority of the Bible and the church, that might be really important for them. God is a super being, opening doors when things go well, or closing doors when things don't go so well. That might be a really important metaphor. In fact, you see this beyond the church. Like, watch any big football game or sporting event, and athletes afterwards will give thanks to God for allowing the victory to take place, as though somehow God is concerned that the Panthers are going to win instead of the Browns, right? And clearly, he never wants the Browns to win, so we don't know what to do with that. Sorry if you're a Cleveland fan. I feel your pain. Or sometimes when there's suffering, like there's this satanic figure, a covert enemy that might be an important narrative for someone. And so if you have that going on, and then you include the belief that at your core, you are unworthy, that at your core, you're toxic. This creates yet one more external, because it's beyond your control, an external belief that impacts the outcomes in your life. And I mean, if you believe that at the essence of who you are is a monumental failure, then how much more are you going to be prone to living out a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure? How much easier would there be a learned type of helplessness that began to be developed in seeing the way that your life unfolds? These are all external locus of control dispositions or attitudes. Conversely speaking, someone with a strong internal locus of control recognizes that while life can be wildly unpredictable, there's a high degree of God-given personal initiative, energy, strength, creativity, confidence that fuels creativity and forward motion in life. It fuels desired outcomes for a person. A person with a strong internal locus of control assumes responsibilities for how their decisions create certain incomes in their life. And then they own fully the responsibility of the type of responses that they give for themselves when things go well as when things don't go so well. And so when you marry a strong internal locus of control and you couple that with a discovery process of just how shaped you've been by the events of your life, how your childhood experiences create coping mechanisms, and how these mechanisms at one point in your life served you really well. They protected you when you were 6 and you didn't know what to do with that moment. Like, they protect you then, but they don't serve you well into adulthood. They create problems in your adult life. And so if you're a religious expression, if your explanation stops with a sin nature, instead of sin as a symptom, you never really get to the root cause of why the decisions in your life or the life that you live are creating problems for yourself and others. I know it's a lot, but in disorganized religion, sin isn't the hook that it is in other environments. Instead, it's a symptom. It's a problem or a wound or a sickness that's yet to be discovered. By the way, man, I think this is both the challenging and the beautiful nature of community. You know, like here at Watershed, I'll speak for this environment first. There's something profound when you sit across the table and you look into the life of another person and vice versa, and you begin to talk about the really hard things that have happened to you growing up or in your lifetime or last week. And instead of the common ground being, look how redeemed and saved we are from our sin, the story shifts to, we share a common brokenness and something of a common goodness. And from there, we get to build forward in our life. That is both beautiful and terrifying. Because in order to get to that place, there's a vulnerability that says, I have to talk about the thing that I really don't want to talk about. I have to revisit some moments in my life that I've done everything to try to avoid. And so it's beautiful, it's messy, it's hard, but it's worth it. It breaks through ceilings often that keep us from loving each other when we're constantly judging who's in and who's out through a lens of sin. In disorganized religion, sin isn't a hook, but a symptom to a problem, a wound, or sickness yet to be discovered. And then lastly, this. In organized religion, sin is the starting point. Right? I've already mentioned that. But if you put the car in reverse and you back the car up and you pass moving backwards, Genesis 3, Adam, Eve, eating of the forbidden fruit. If you back it up past, you're hopelessly corrupt as a starting point. You wind up at Genesis 1. You wind up at the garden, and there's this beautiful expression of earth, sky, stars, dust, plant life, microbes, there's biology and there's chemistry. There's seas and oceans. There's wildlife, there's aquatic life, and then there's human life. And after every 24-hour progression in the story, God pushes pause and he says, this is really good. He basks in his own creation or her own creation. I'll let you figure that one out. And by the time we get to an Adam and Eve figure being created, God is literally saying, this is really, really good. In disorganized religion, sin isn't the starting point. Goodness is the original starting point. I remember the first time that I saw or looked into the eyes of our first child, Jyoti. She's 18 and she's getting ready to graduate from high school in a couple of weeks. And if you're familiar with our story, you know this already, but we built our family through international adoption. So we got 3 kids from 3 different places in the world. And we didn't have the privilege of holding our child, moments after they had been born. Instead, our version of that was a FedEx package. Our agency would call and say, we're sending you a FedEx package with a picture and with documentation. And so I remember the first time this happened for us, we were in Jacksonville, Florida, and it had been about 11 months since we'd applied, and they said, hey, I think we have a match for you, so it'll be there in 3 days, which felt like 3 years. And we got to the day the package came, and we ripped it open, and there was this document with all of the information for Jyoti, that was our daughter, but at the top was a wallet-sized picture of her. And I remember looking in to her eyes, and I still carry that picture in my wallet 17 years later. But I remember looking into her eyes and being struck with this deep sense of beauty and hope. And for 16 years now, because she's been with us for 16 years. For 16 years, and this is true of all my kids, when I look into their eyes, even at our hardest moments together, when they're blowing it or I'm blowing it or there's conflict or whatever, it's all I can really see. I mentioned this book last week, but there's a book called Bitten by a Camel, Leaving Church and Finding God, which is a book title and not a suggestion for the record. But Kent Dobson, writing about the first time that he ever looked into the eyes of his daughter, writes this. He says, it was almost terrifying to fall in love so immediately and so wholeheartedly, to feel so responsible and so helpless at the same time. But to believe my daughter was a problem to God was unthinkable. Her essence wasn't sinful. Her essence was mystery and goodness. She did not need to be covered by blood. She didn't need a special prayer or a magical baptismal water to be accepted by God. I loved my daughter just the way she was, and I was sure that God did too. I didn't need anything more from her or wish she were born with a better essence. And this is merely human love. And then he writes, it cannot be true that God is less loving than I am. When you're told that your starting point is unworthiness, when it's corruption, when it's an inescapable toxicity, it's hard to believe in yourself, isn't it? Not to mention, it's really hard to believe in a God that really does love you always and without exception. But I think this is the dissonance that if you have the eyes to see it, you see it rising out of the scriptures in the words of the authors themselves. As they're working through the only way they know how to understand God. I mentioned a tribal view of God last week. And in their context, gods were these powerful figures that punished people who couldn't get it right and blessed people when they did. And yet within the pages of the Bible, sitting within the context of some of these same ways of thinking about God, you see a rising way of thinking, a language that suggests at the core of who they were, they just couldn't bring themselves to believe that God would be less loving than the ways that they're experiencing love with each other in community. And when Jesus comes on the scene, they couldn't believe that God would be less loving than Christ. And is there ever a point in your spiritual journey, in your journey or your way of understanding your past and what you're moving towards, is there ever a point where it would be in your best interest to let go of the way that you've understood yourself through a lens of sin and begin to hold on, instead of original sin as an idea, instead original blessing? A way of creating a starting point that acknowledges that the decisions with your life are, if you will allow them to be developed, are growing out of this deep place of love and acceptance versus separation and unworthiness. And so, here's what I want to do this morning. I thought it might be interesting to revisit some of these places where it appears that this way of thinking is rising out of something that even the authors of the Bible didn't understand themselves. And just allow the words that were written 2,000 years ago to wash over us and maybe even become our words this morning. And so in the Psalms, the psalmist writes, "Give thanks to the God of heaven, for his steadfast love endures forever. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us." How great is the love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. And whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not know love does not know God, because God is love. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. For everything God created, everything is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, because it is consecrated by the word or the reality of God. And then finally this, I am convinced, writes Paul, that nothing can ever separate us from God's love. Neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither our fears for today or our worries about tomorrow. Not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. No power in the sky above or the earth below. Indeed, nothing in all creation will ever be able to separate us from the love of God that is revealed in Christ Jesus, our Lord.